Interrogation of Survivors of Crew of U-433, a 500-ton U-boat, sunk at about 23:48 on Sunday, 16th November 1941, in position 36 degrees by 13 north, 4 degrees by 42 west. Section 1. Introductory Remarks. U-433 was sunk at midnight on 16th November, and U-95 was sunk in the early morning of 28th November, 1941. 37 survivors from the former and 11 from the latter arrived in the interrogation center together on 21st December, 1941, and were interrogated at the same time. Owing to the length of time elapsing since the sinkings, and to opportunities prisoners had to converse among themselves, it was found that they were exceptionally security conscious, particularly the officers. 2 or 3 of the petty officers of U-433 had conspired together to concoct a fantastic story which centered round the fact that the U-boat had left on her last cruise from a port about 50 miles south of Spezia, Italy. Some time elapsed before this story could be proved false. Interrogating officers were happily able to confront the more reticent members of the crew with captured documents and papers which proved beyond doubt that they had been in St. Nazaire a bare week before their sinking. In this manner, the importance of preserving all scraps of paper taken from prisoners, however irrelevant they may appear upon first perusal, was again demonstrated. U-433 proved to be the first U-boat sunk in the Mediterranean from which German prisoners have been captured. As U-433 and U-95 had embarked on the same mission, and subsequently the fate of their crews became closely interlocked, it was decided that all general information should be collated for publication in a later report, namely that on interrogation of a prisoner from U-451. Therefore, this report on U-433 contains only such information as concerns this U-boat. Since the destruction of U-433 and U-95, the following 6 U-boats have been sunk during the month of December 1941, from which survivors have been captured. By boat, date sunk, and number of survivors: U-131, 17th December 1941, 48 survivors. U-434, 18th December 1941, 44 survivors. U-574, 19th December 1941, 16 survivors. U-451, 21st December 1941, 1 survivor. U-79, 23rd December 1941, 44 survivors. U-75, 28th December 1941, 30 survivors. The crews of U-79 and U-75, sunk in the Mediterranean, are being interrogated in the Middle East. Section 2. Crew of U-433. The complement of U-433, totaling 44 men in all, consisted of 6 officers, including 2 midshipmen under training, 3 chief petty officers, 11 petty officers, and 24 ratings, of which 1 petty officer and 5 ratings did not survive. The commanding officer, Oberleutnant zur See Hans I., was born in 1916 in Hanover, which city later adopted U-433. He was unmarried. He belonged to the 1935 term, becoming a midshipman in 1936, and in 1937 he had served in the destroyer Theodor Riedel on the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla. He was promoted to sub-lieutenant in April 1938 and served in the 6th Destroyer Flotilla, one of the North Sea flotillas. He was promoted to lieutenant in October 1938. Prisoners stated that I had previously served as first lieutenant with Kuppisch in U-94, for which boat some considerable successes were claimed during the latter part of 1940 and early months of 1941. I was stated to have been serving on board U-94 when 36,000 tons were sunk, and to have subsequently been in command of a boat which sank 8,000 tons on one Atlantic cruise. He had been awarded the decoration of the Iron Cross First Class for these services. In spite of I's earlier successes, one of the petty officer telegraphists of U-433 stated that he had more confidence in the captain of a U-boat he had served in previously. This petty officer stated that it was considered an honor to be given command of a U-boat destined for the Mediterranean. I appeared to be a good type of naval officer and did not seem to be too adversely affected by his recent experience. He had made, with Captain Lieutenant Schreiber of U-95, a determined effort to escape into Spain from Gibraltar, where he spent some weeks before being transferred to England. The first lieutenant, Lieutenant Zersee Helmut Trommel, 22 years of age, a native of Bad Wöldungen, Hessen, joined the Navy in 1937. As a cadet, he had made a cruise in the battleship Schleswig-Holstein to the West Indies, touching at Falmouth. In April 1939, he became a midshipman, carrying out his training at the Marineschule Mürwik. During the early part of 1940, he served in the cruiser Emden, in which ship he was promoted to sub-lieutenant. In November 1940, he joined the U-boat school at Pillau, and in March 1941 was appointed as junior officer to U-433, some weeks before commissioning. It seems probable that he made one or more operational cruises for training before joining U-433. Trommel was by no means in good health, and whilst in Bergen in August 1941, had been twice medically examined, as it was suspected that he was consumptive. In November 1941 at St. Nazaire, whilst preparing for the last cruise, Trommel was appointed first lieutenant, relieving Oberleutnant Georg Pross. The junior officer was Oberfähnrich Zersee Eberhard Happel, born in Reichenbach in Vogtland Mountains, was 20 years of age and had joined the Navy in 1939. His father was the headmaster of a school. He became a midshipman in July 1940 and a senior midshipman a year later. Prior to joining the U-boat arm early in 1941, he had served in patrol vessels. He had volunteered for the U-boat service and had undergone training in the U-boat school in Pillau, and appears to have made several war cruises in other U-boats before joining and relieving Trommel as junior officer of U-433 at St. Nazaire in October 1941. Two midshipmen, Kolb and Wächter, joined U-433 for training in October 1941 at St. Nazaire. Fähnrich Zersee Franz Kolb, 20 years of age, was born at Mühlhausen near Heidelberg. He joined the Navy in October 1940 and underwent initial training at Stralsund and later in the cruiser Prinz Eugen. He had not undergone any course at the U-boat school. This was to have followed after 2 or 3 cruises in U-433. He was a pleasant and able young officer. Fähnrich Zersee Hans Wächter, 21 years of age, was a native of Berlin and joined the Navy in December 1939, undergoing training in the school sailing ship Gurk Fock and the battleship Schlesien, and later served in patrol vessels off the French coast. He became a midshipman in September 1941 but had done no U-boat school training. He was exceptionally polite during interrogation. The engineer officer, Oberleutnant Engineer Lieutenant Gunther Gess, was born in 1918 in Stralsund. He joined the Navy in September 1937 and made a 7-month cruise in the cruiser Emden, commanded by Kapitänsersee Buchner, becoming midshipman engineer in 1938. For 6 months up to October 1939, he served in the destroyer Hermann Kuhne, being promoted to sub-lieutenant engineer in August 1939. He joined the U-boat school in Palau in December 1940 and was appointed to U-433 early in 1941 to stand by the U-boat before commissioning. U-433 would appear to be the first U-boat in which he had served as engineer officer. He was promoted to Oberleutnant engineer. In September 1941, he created a good impression whilst undergoing interrogation and appeared to be a keen and capable officer. Although polite, he was very much on guard against giving any useful information. The chief quartermaster, 30 years of age, was a good type, but had little experience in U-boats, to which arm he had been drafted early in 1941, U-433 being his first boat. He was very reticent and had taken pains to instruct the crew in security matters, particularly during their passage from Gibraltar to England. The chief mechanician in charge of the electrical equipment, 26 years of age, had served in U-boats since 1936, whereas the chief mechanician in charge of the diesels had only been in U-boats since 1940. He had previously served with Top in U-552. Of the 9 petty officers interrogated, 3 had joined the U-boat service towards the end of 1939, 2 during 1940, and 4 early in 1941. Thus, for almost half of them, U-433 was their first boat. Most of the surviving other ratings were not more than 20 years of age and had been drafted to the U-boat service between January and April 1941, and for them, U-433 was their first experience of a war cruise. Some of the younger prisoners stated that they had volunteered for the U-boat service, but it seems unlikely that they had much option. They were typical Hitler products, U-boat fodder with no experience and very little intelligence. As usual, all had been carefully instructed in security and had had ample opportunity of regaining their power of resistance before interrogation. Section 3. Early History of U-433. Prisoners were unable to state when this boat was laid down or launched. U-433 was a 500-ton U-boat built by the Schiffenwerft Danzig, being Type 7C, and similar to the captured U-570, now HMS Graf. See Confidential Book 4051-31. It was stated that U-434, which was being built on the same slip as U-433, was well advanced in May 1941 and was expected to be launched shortly afterwards. U-435 was also stated to be building there at this time. Captured documents substantiated by prisoners' statements proved that U-433 was commissioned on 24th May 1941 and allocated to the 3rd U-boat flotilla. Some members of the crew were drafted to Danzig shortly before commissioning, and during this period resided in a building which had previously been an old Polish post office, the remainder joining on commissioning, with the exception of a few who joined later in Kiel. Preliminary trials were carried out from Danzig as base for a period of 3 weeks. About middle of June 1941, U-433 proceeded to Kiel, where torpedoes were embarked including 2 in upper deck containers, and trials continued off Wesermunde for a period of 4 to 5 weeks. It was stated that these trials were carried out alone and that no dummy attacks on convoys or refueling exercises were practiced. During torpedo trials, U-433 fired 4 to 5 torpedoes each day, and exercises in the laying of torpedo mines were said to have been conducted, 2 mines being loaded into each tube, although later no mines were carried. After 12 days, leave had been granted to each watch. U-433 sailed from Kiel about the middle of July, and passing through the belt via Kristiansand and Bergen, arrived 4 days later in Trondheim. It is possible that on this voyage U-433 called for a short time at Horten. In Trondheim, U-433 was berthed alongside the Huaxgaren, a converted merchantman now used as a depot ship. It was stated that 4 or 5 500-ton U-boats were also at Trondheim at this time. NID note: U-570 and U-501 are known to have been carrying out torpedo trials at this time off Low Fjord, a few miles north of Trondheim. A third boat also believed to have been present was either U-84 or U-87. U-433 remained in the Trondheim area for 2 to 3 weeks until mid-August, carrying out further torpedo and other trials outside Low Fjord. When in Low Fjord, U-boats berthed alongside the depot ship Vesa. The Hertha and Black Prince were also stated to be in this fjord. 2 patrol vessels, Forpostenbåte, were here, but no destroyers or other warships, and only a few small merchant vessels. Prisoners stated that an accident occurred during torpedo trials, the battery of an exercise torpedo generating a gas which leaked and caused an explosion, all but blinding one of the petty officers. This man was put ashore. NID note: the petty officer in question is probably Mechanicsmat, Petty Officer Artificer 2nd Class Kallenbach, who is known to have left the U-433 in Norway, together with 2 engine room petty officers named Fink and Pinkau. The crew of U-433 appear to have enjoyed their stay in Trondheim, where car trips and other amusements were organized for them, there being apparently no lack of schnapps and light beer. During their stay, the crew were accommodated partially on board and partially in one of the depot ships. Here preparations were made for their first operational cruise, amongst others, the crew being issued with fur coats, fur trousers, and blue fur-lined headgear. In view of the Russian campaign, Vice Admiral U-boats had given instructions for warm clothing to be issued at once, as the Army were appropriating all available stocks. Later prisoners stated they were instructed to surrender warm underclothing for the Army, which caused no little annoyance. During trimming trials on the day before sailing, whilst proceeding at half speed on both diesels, a fracture occurred in the starboard reversing gear, which necessitated a spare being obtained by air from Kiel, the fitting of which delayed their departure and caused them to visit Bergen, where they arrived on or about 17th August 1941. 2 days after their arrival at Bergen, where a yard had been reserved for the use of U-boats, the spare part arrived, and the necessary repairs were effected, and the boat completed with oil fuel. Prisoners stated that at Bergen at this time were present 1 other U-boat, 1 patrol vessel, and a vessel being used as a depot ship. During their week's stay in Bergen, some of the crew were billeted in the pension Metropole, and the remainder in other quarters in the town. Although the blackout was in force, the crew nominally confined to their billets after a certain hour. They succeeded, disguised as fishermen, in breaking out on amorous escapades the favorable rate of exchange giving a ready supply of kroner for these purposes. At Bergen, Lieutenant Sir C. Trummel, who had been ailing for some time, was medically examined, being apparently a suspect consumptive, but X-ray photographs showed this not to be the case. Section 4. First War Cruise of U-433. On or about 24th August 1941, U-433 sailed on her first war cruise, which proved not only unsuccessful, but also the only war cruise she undertook prior to the cruise during which she was sunk. NID note: it is known that U-570, possibly accompanied by U-68, sailed from Trondheim on 24th August 1941, presumably on the same mission. Owing to the danger of patrolling British submarines, U-433 sailed from Bergen in the evening at 1900 hours, the crew having been mustered 1 hour previously. 2 brass bands, 1 naval, and 1 attached to the local anti-aircraft batteries, played the U-boat on her way as she passed the quayside. As the strains of the march, "We're Sailing Against England," died away, U-433 increased to full speed ahead while still in the harbor, and, possibly owing to the general excitement, was inadvertently steered over a shallow patch where she grazed bottom. This incident was considered of little account, and U-433 proceeded to sea, being escorted by 2 patrol vessels. For this cruise she carried 14 torpedoes in all, 12 within the boat and 2 in upper-deck containers. Having parted company with her escorts, U-433 made her way across the North Sea, and having passed between the Shetlands and the Faroes, took up station in an operational area 60 miles square off Iceland. When U-570, now HMS Graf, was captured on 27th August 1941, see Confidential Book 405131, U-433 was stated by prisoners to have been in the vicinity and to have picked up U-570's distress signal reporting that she had been bombed by aircraft and could not dive. Accordingly, U-433 reported to Vice Admiral U-boats that she had intended to render assistance, but she was ordered to ignore the distress signal and remain where she was. U-433 remained for 7 or 8 days in the operational area allotted to her, 2 other incidents of note occurring during this time. On one occasion, whilst patrolling at the bottom of her square, a plume of smoke was sighted, its disappearance being followed soon thereafter by a formidable explosion. It was surmised that the ship in question had been sunk by the companion U-boat operating in the square south of that of U-433. On a second occasion, 2 plumes of smoke were sighted, and U-433 began to dive in order to carry out an attack. While the U-boat was in an act of diving, the radio operator picked up a message from Vice Admiral U-boats to themselves, stating that 2 Swedish ships were approaching their vicinity and were to be allowed to pass unmolested. The message arrived just in time, as inspection showed up that the ships responsible for the smoke were indeed the Swedes. On or about 4th September 1941, U-433 received orders to proceed in a westerly direction. According to a petty officer prisoner, U-433 had reached a position a few hundred miles off the coast of Newfoundland when she received further orders to put about and intercept a convoy. Prisoners are confused as to the next events, but it appears that after racing 2 nights and a day at full speed, U-433 made contact with a convoy at a time when it was already engaged in a running fight with other U-boats, who had succeeded in torpedoing some victims. NID note: Convoy SC-42 was attacked on the night of 9th-10th September, The attacks were continued intermittently until the morning of 11th September. U-501 was sunk by Chambly and Moosejaw at 2140 on 10th September. Penciled note: ship time 0300 11/9/41 CB 405130. When U-433 arrived on the scene, the escorting destroyer screen had been considerably increased, while patches of fog had made conditions for a successful attack doubly difficult. U-433 was kept at a distance from the convoy by a destroyer and was out of contact throughout the following night. On the next day, while proceeding on the surface, U-433 was surprised by either a Sunderland or a Catalina aircraft, which was stated by one prisoner to have attacked with 2 bombs, both missing, although other prisoners deny that bombs were dropped. U-433 endeavored to dive at once, but at the first attempt the vents jammed, and it was some minutes before the defect could be cleared, enabling the U-boat to make her escape underwater. This incident is alleged to have occurred 2.5 weeks after leaving Bergen, and would therefore be on or about 12th September 1941. NID note: there were several air attacks south of Iceland on 11th and 12th September, not too far away from convoy SC-42. For the rest of this day, U-433 proceeded submerged, but towards evening prisoners claimed that they had received a signal giving the position of the convoy. Throughout the night, U-433 continued in hot pursuit, finally to make contact with a ship stated to be already in flames, and with a few escort vessels standing by. U-433 approached to within approximately 3,000 meters, 3,280 yards, to make an attack, and fired 3 torpedoes from periscope depth. All these torpedoes were misses, but prisoners state that they heard one detonation at a time when the torpedoes had passed their intended objective. They believed it possible that a ship accidentally in the line of fire might have been struck, but they did not claim this possible as a definite success. Prisoners excused their lack of success by blaming poor visibility and the heavy seas alleged to have been running at this time. U-433 now proceeded to follow up the convoy and again received a signal giving its exact position. The next encounter was with a 4,000-ton ship, which prisoners alleged was mistaken for a merchantman, but in reality they stated proved to be a Q ship. Oberleutnant Zersi ordered the U-boat to dive and approached cautiously at periscope depth. Prisoners stated that when he came within comfortable visible range, to his consternation he saw a number of small, fast motorboats being lowered over the side. These motorboats were stated to be carrying depth charges. He took this to mean that his position was detected, and at once dived to a considerable depth. Scarcely had he reached a depth considered to be safe when a rain of depth charges fell and exploded in the vicinity, but too far away to cause damage to the U-boat. U-433 turned away and, after proceeding for some time submerged, surfaced and avoided further attacks. The next day, contact was again re-established with the convoy. Stating 3 large merchantmen, accompanied by 3 destroyers. U-433 was maneuvering into a suitable position to carry out an attack when suddenly the periscope became obscured by, it was believed, a greasy rag. There appears to have been some argument among the officers as to the best course to adopt, and according to a petty officer, Oberleutnant Zersi Pross, the first lieutenant at this time, urged that U-433 should surface quickly, fire 3 torpedoes, then dive at once and make her escape. I, however, refused to be persuaded, and counting discretion for the better part of valor, turned the U-boat away to a healthier locality. NID note: this incident cannot be traced. The story of a Q ship and the small fast motorboat is apocryphal, as may well be the remainder of these statements. If prisoners' accounts are to be believed, this incident ended U-433's adventures on her first war cruise, and presumably acting on orders from Vice Admiral U-boats, she made her way to St. Nazaire, proceeding at half speed during daylight hours and full speed at night. One last thrill for the crew occurred as U-433 was about to pass the mine barrier off the French coast, where it was believed that a British submarine was shadowing them. Prisoners stated that as they had been forbidden to fire torpedoes when in mined areas, they increased to full speed to shake off their pursuer. At 09:30 on 3rd October 1941, the date of U-433's arrival in St. Nazaire, while lying off the harbor, prisoners stated that they received a distress message from a U-boat which read, "Have been torpedoed." This U-boat, they alleged, should have reached port 24 hours before them, and they presumed she had been torpedoed in the harbor mouth. NID note: this incident cannot be identified. 2 hours after the reception of this signal, U-433 entered St. Nazaire Harbor, still carrying 11 of her torpedoes after 5 weeks at sea and flying not a single victory pennant. She moored alongside a pier. Having arrived in St. Nazaire, the crew, who seemed to have been generally over-fond of the bottle, lost no time in sampling the pleasures of the port. On the first night, a number were helplessly drunk, and a petty officer behaved so obstreperously that he was confined to his quarters on the U-boat for 7 days and refused all leave. The majority of the other members of the crew each received 12 days' leave in addition to 2 days' traveling time, which was granted in 2 consecutive periods in watches. Across each man's leave pass, I wrote the grandiloquent phrase, "Engaged in the most exacting occupation, U-boat warfare against England." This recommendation apparently entitled the bearer to extra food rations and railway travel concessions. While half the crew were away, U-433 was moved into No. 1 dock, where a general overhaul was carried out by German workmen. During this period of refitting, which lasted for rather more than 5 weeks, U-433 was twice moved to a U-boat shelter upon the sounding of an air raid alarm. Prisoners stated that U-433 shared her shelter with another U-boat, the number of which had conveniently been forgotten by the entire crew. It was alleged that while U-433 lay in the open, no attempt was made to camouflage her. At this time, only a skeleton watch remained on board. U-433's officers were accommodated in the Hotel Roseraie at the neighboring La Balle, and crew in a U-boat home, stated to be about a quarter of an hour's walk from the docks. Cars were provided for the use of officers and crew, and according to one prisoner, these vehicles bear the "snorting bull" device, originally displayed by Captain Lieutenant Prien on the conning tower of his U-boat, and known as the steer of Scapa Flow. This device apparently now the emblem of the whole of the 7th Flotilla base on St. Nazaire, and to which U-433 was now reallocated. A delivery note taken from a prisoner shows that on 20th October 1941, U-433 embarked special canteen stores which included 150 half-pound packets of chocolate, 18 bottles of rum, 20 pounds of fruit bonbons, 24 pounds of chocolate drops, 50 cartons of sweets, 100 pounds of sweet biscuits, 200 packets of Coca-Cola, 180 packets of dextroenergen. Both these latter articles are special energizing tablets. Early in November 1941, U-433 completed with oil from a tanker and received 14 torpedoes, the remaining from her first cruise having been landed when she first entered port. On 5th November 1941, U-433 put to sea, but had only been out 1 day when a leak developed in the control room. U-433 immediately returned to Saint-Nazaire, where she arrived on 7th November, and repairs were at once undertaken. By 8th November 1941, these repairs had been completed, but during the day a number of ratings had gone ashore and again become thoroughly intoxicated. Among captured documents is a report by an engine room petty officer describing how he discovered 3 engine room ratings incapably drunk at 1500 on 8th November 1941, sitting on some sacking outside the Saint-Nazaire railway station. When these men returned on board, they brought with them a case of beer, which was immediately broached. A fight started in the diesel room, where one of the ratings had been sick, and the 3 chief culprits had to be forcibly ejected from this compartment. It was stated that these men were unable to go on watch for a further 8 hours. While in Saint-Nazaire, Oberleutnant Zersi Georg Preuss left U-433 to become interrogating officer at Les Balles, and 3 midshipmen named Happel, Vector, and Kolb joined the boat. The junior officer, Lieutenant Zersi Trummel, was promoted to first lieutenant, the place of the junior officer being filled by Happel, who expected to become Lieutenant Zersi in April 1942. Section 5. Last cruise of U-433. U-433 sailed from Saint-Nazaire on her second and last cruise at about 1700 on 9th November 1941. For the first stage of her journey, she was accompanied by 2 Messerschmitt 109 fighter aircraft, and for 10 miles by 4 patrol vessels. According to a petty officer prisoner, a boat, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Endras, left Saint-Nazaire at the same time as U-433, but he did not know where Endras was bound. NID note: it is believed that Endras is in command of U-567. U-433 sailed under sealed orders, and prisoners stated that it was not until they were well out to sea that they were instructed by Vice Admiral U-boats to make for an Italian port, Genoa being mentioned, which was to be their base for Mediterranean operations. It was believed by prisoners that they were to be one of 4 U-boats based on that port, 2 of which were commanded by Captain Lieutenant Guggenberger, U-81, and Rechke, U-205, which U-boats were involved in the sinking of Ark Royal. The 3rd U-boat was to have been U-95, Captain Lieutenant Schreiber, sunk on 28th November 1941. U-433 accordingly made her way to Gibraltar, continually sighting aircraft and being forced to dive. Prisoners stated that they arrived off the Straits of Gibraltar on 13th November 1941. When night fell, they slipped through on the surface, keeping close to the Tangier shore. They clearly saw the lights of Tangier and later Melilla, and also the Rock of Gibraltar. There was a certain amount of traffic in the straits, and it was alleged that on one occasion a corvette, outward bound, passed within 1.5 miles of the U-boat. Signals from patrol boats were also seen, but it appeared obvious that they were not challenging U-433. The progress of the U-boat appears to have been alternate bursts of full speed ahead and spells of drifting with stopped engines. The next 2 days, U-433 loitered in the vicinity of the straits, sailing within Spanish territorial waters by night and outside them by day. The morning of 16th November 1941 broke clear and sunny, and I announced to his officers that he intended to approach Ceuta and lie off there to make observations on the following day. It was while carrying out this maneuver that disaster overtook U-433. Section 6. Sinking of U-433. On Sunday night, 16th November 1941, the corvette Marigold, having been delayed by engine defects, was proceeding to overtake a convoy escorted by Deptford, Wild Swan, and 4 corvettes in the eastern approaches to the Straits of Gibraltar. NID note: this was a dummy convoy intended to draw U-boats known to be operating close to the eastward of Gibraltar. The sea was calm with a slight swell, light airs, and visibility 1 mile. Course was 020 degrees, speed 12 knots. At approximately 2250, when in position 36 degrees 13 north and 4 degrees 42 west, the radio direction finding operator reported a contact bearing red 30. Orders were given to him to hold it, and this he did successfully. From his reports, it was evident that the contact was passing rapidly down the port side. Course was altered towards full speed ahead, rung on engines, and action stations sounded. Range closed rapidly, and when it was 2,000 yards, the contact was identified as a submarine, which later proved to be U-433. Orders were given to the depth charges crews to set a pattern at 50 feet. The target altered course towards, and at this point Marigold altered course to port under full helm. Helm was kept on until the submarine was again fine on port bow, and order "stand by to ram" given. Asdic contact was now made and held. As the submarine proceeded from port to starboard, course was altered to keep her fine on port bow till close range. When submarine had closed the 300 yards, the bridge lookout reported that she was crash diving. The order "stand by" was given to the depth charge crews, and on attacking course of 90 degree, a pattern of 5 depth charges was fired at 23:10. Up to this stage, if prisoners' accounts are to be believed, I, who had been stalking Marigold for some time, still considered that he had the situation well in hand, and indeed that he would be able to dictate the future course of events. It would appear that U-433 sighted Marigold before she herself was perceived, and had maneuvered into position to carry out torpedo attack on what was taken to be a light cruiser. This failure to identify their target immediately was attributed by prisoners to the excellent camouflage of the corvette, which gave her the appearance of a much larger vessel. Having gained the position he wished, I decided to try a surface attack, and fired 3 bow torpedoes fanwise, none of which hit. This lack of success apparently shook the nerves of the U-boat men. The torpedoes had been fired with rams in use to prevent the escape of air bubbles, which would have disturbed the strongly phosphorescent water. Nevertheless, bright white tracks were visible from the U-boat, as the torpedoes had been fired with a depth setting of only 2 meters. It was considered inevitable that the position of the U-boat must have been revealed. As the torpedoes were approaching their mark, prisoners state that Marigold turned away at full speed, as they believed, to take avoiding action. As no mention of torpedoes is contained in Marigold's report, it must be assumed that this sudden change of course was more providential than planned. As the corvette was turning, I fired a 4th torpedo. This, prisoners stated, actually hit Marigold, but at an angle which prevented the pistol detonating. At this point, prisoners alleged Marigold fired star shells and turned towards. As he had now no more bow torpedoes available, I apparently decided to crash dive. Accordingly, U-433 submerged to a depth of 120 meters, or 390 feet. Marigold's first depth charge pattern was heard to explode some distance away from the U-boat, and no damage whatsoever was reported. U-433's crew appear to have been taking things very easily, for a number of prisoners have stated that at the time of the first depth charge attack, they had not been ordered to action stations and were still asleep. On board Marigold, after the depth charges had exploded, speed was reduced to half ahead. The HSD carried out the normal procedure to regain contact astern, but nothing could be picked out from the disturbances caused by the depth charges. At 23:17, as no sub-contact had been regained, it was decided to carry out a block search. Course was altered to 20 degrees and maintained for 10 minutes. It was estimated that after the attack by depth charges, the submarine would alter course away, and at 23:27, the turn was made to port. Course was 290 degrees, and at 23:37, altered to 200 degrees. At 23:44, contact was gained, bearing dead ahead. Range was 1,200 yards. It was classified immediately as a submarine, and it was decided to attack without opening the range. A pattern of depth charges was already set to 150 feet and 300 feet. Target was reported to be moving slowly left, and a course of 190 degrees was set. Target steadied, and at 23:45, at a range of 900 yards, attacking speed was rung, and the order "stand by" given to depth charge crews. The target began to move slowly right, and course was altered to bring target on the port bow. Target was kept edged off, and at 23:47, at a range of 200 yards, course being 215 degrees, and attack was made. And approximately 23:48, the order "fire" was given at pattern of 10 depth charges, setting E, fired in succession. Water below in U-433, I and his officers had been completely deceived by Marigold's movements. In anticipation of the first pattern of depth charges, the U-boat's hydrophones had been switched off, but as no further pattern followed immediately, they were again switched on. It was reported that propeller noises could be heard, but they were fading in the distance. The next half hour was spent by I and his officers in consulting as to the next step. I immediately was in favor of surfacing and making use of the cover of night to effect an escape, a course which appears to have been against the wishes of the crew, who later blamed their commander among themselves for throwing away his U-boat. As no further noises were reported by the hydrophones, however, I decided that he could safely carry out his plan. Accordingly, orders were given to surface. U-433 rose to 60 feet, where she was checked for listening purposes. What happened next is best described in the words of a midshipman prisoner. All of a sudden, there was a terrible sound of propellers to starboard. The devil had been lying in wait quite close to us, with engines stopped. We put our nose down to dive again, and she came directly over us. We could hear her propellers inside the boat. We weren't very deep, and she probably saw our wake. She then dropped depth charges. They were terribly close. The U-boat heeled over and plunged deeply. There was a leak forward, and everything imaginable was damaged. The high-pressure air whistled through the boat. The switchboards of the main motors were smashed, and the gyro compass overturned. Everything in the wireless telegraph room was wrecked. The forward spare torpedoes had broken adrift from their stowage. You never saw such a mess on board. It was then, I believe, that the order, "Put on life-saving apparatus," was given. We were steadily going down. The boat was breaking up and sinking very slowly. A prisoner stated that had these depth charges not been set too deep, the effect would have been even more devastating. A petty officer stated that 3 depth charges exploded below the U-boat, 1 amidships and below, and 2 beneath the bows. A 4th exploded above, while the remainder fell each side. The depth charge over the boat severely damaged the 8.8 centimeter gun and the 2 centimeter machine gun, the barrel of the latter being pressed flat and the cocking lever torn off. These, which exploded beneath the boat, caused the major damage within the pressure hull. These caused the boat to tremble violently. The welded seams parted, the doors of the refrigerator and all lockers burst open, cascading a conglomeration of tinned foods and other provisions and the personal belongings of the crew into the boat. All but the emergency lights were extinguished. The starboard electric motor seized. The majority of instruments in the control room were smashed. At this time, when U-433 appeared hopelessly lost, I gave the order, "Blow tanks, prepare to abandon ship." Using the last of her compressed air, the U-boat labored up towards the surface. The midshipman prisoner, already quoted, stated that the rudder was out of action, but the hand gear was manned. As the U-boat broke surface, I opened the conning tower hatch and stuck there, owing to the terrific pressure of air from the boat. The chief quartermaster, who was directly below at the hatch, was blown up in the conning tower and fell down there. At this moment, the starboard diesel was started up. Marigold reported that almost immediately after the explosions of the last pattern of depth charges, U-433 was seen to surface dead astern. Helm was put hard a starboard and orders given to the 4-inch gun, the Lewis guns on the bridge, and the pom-pom to train on and open fire. Tracer bullets were observed hitting the conning tower immediately. The 4-inch gun could not be depressed enough as range was too short, but it was kept firing. The crew of the submarine were heard screaming, and as Marigold passed close to the target, men were seen and heard in the water, and it was clear that the U-boat was being abandoned. The hissing of blown tanks was heard, and engines were still running as the U-boat proceeded on the surface, steering a zigzag course, making it impossible to board her. Close contact was kept with the submarine and fire maintained until at midnight. After 2 explosions, presumably scuttling charges, were heard aboard, she sank. Prisoners stated that when giving the order to abandon ship, I also ordered his ship to be scuttled. These preparations consisted in fixing scuttling charges, timed to explode in 10 minutes, next to the torpedoes remaining in the bow compartment, ordering full speed ahead on one functioning diesel engine, and in opening the vents. This task was supervised by the engineer officer in accordance with a prearranged routine. After these preparations were completed, the entire crew were ordered into the water. No person remained on board U-433 who plowed her way through the men as they were swimming and possibly ran 1 or 2 down. Shortly afterwards, the crew watched their boat sink, following 2 explosions believed to have been caused by the warheads of torpedoes detonated by the scuttling charges. After the sinking of U-433, Marigold sent away her starboard lifeboat to pick up survivors, and at 02:15 on 17th November 1941, the starboard lifeboat was hoisted in. All survivors, numbering 38, that could be seen or heard, had been picked up. Prisoners stated that at least 2 of their number, an engine room petty officer and an engine room rating, had been foolhardy enough to strike out for the Spanish coast, which they judged was at least 30 miles away. They themselves, after a lengthy immersion, were chilled and numb, and no one could possibly have survived a swim which, under an ideal conditions, even if it were possible, would have demanded exceptional endurance. They added that 6 men in all were lost. Some prisoners were at a loss to account for the fact that their U-boat had been abandoned, and they boasted that, had they been in place of their captain, they would have endeavored to escape. There appears little doubt, however, that the U-boat was very badly damaged, and that I, having made his initial blunder, took the only course left open to him. N.I.D. Note: Prisoners' statements regarding depth of the U-boat should be treated with particular reserve. Section 7. Details of U-433. General remarks. U-433 was a 500-ton U-boat Type 7C built at the Schiffswerft Danzig, being of the series U-431 to U-448, building at this yard. Some prisoners stated that this boat was of Type 7C, which was designed by Frederick Krupp Kiel, and the same type of the series U-551 to U-651 built at Blom and Voss, Hamburg. This is known to be correct. U-570 of this type was captured on the 27th August 1941 and was commissioned as HMS Graf and is described in detail in CB 405131 and CB 405133. U-433 would seem to be the first U-boat of her series built by Schiffswerft to have been sunk. Gunnery Armament. Prisoners stated that U-433 mounted one 8.8 centimeter gun and one 2 centimeter machine gun. Torpedo and mining armament. 4 bow and 1 stern torpedo tubes were fitted. 14 torpedoes were carried, 5 in the tubes, 7 reloads internally and 2 reloads externally in upper deck containers, which were stated to be fitted 1 forward and 1 aft. As described in Section 3, an explosion occurred during trials which was attributed to this gas generated by one of the electric torpedoes. No mines were carried, although mine laying had been exercised during trials, 2 mines being loaded into each tube. Diesels. Prisoners stated that the diesels were 6-cylinder, 4-cycle of Krupp manufacture. Main motors. The main motors were stated to be of Siemens manufacture, given a maximum of 600 HP at 470 revolutions per minute. A prisoner denied that diesel-electric propulsion, as described in CB 405131, was used. Diving angle. The engineer officer stated normally they used a 10-degree diving angle, and in some circumstances they had exceeded this angle. Detector gear. S-Gerät, German Asdic. A prisoner stated that U-433 was fitted with S-Gerät, fitted with transmitting and receiving gear which could be revolved 360 degrees. The apparatus was stated to be effective up to 10 kilometers and would search a sector of 20 degrees to 30 degrees in any direction. NID note. These figures are obviously exaggerated. S-Gerät appears to cover all forms of transmitting detector apparatus. 2 distinct forms are known. KDB gear, the German Asdic, of which few details are yet known. AEG gear, the mine detector device. In U-570, now Graf, it was estimated that AEG gear could obtain bearings up to 45 degrees on each bow and up to a similar angle of elevation and depression. The gear itself does not elevate or train. Underwater sound apparatus, UT Anlage. A petty officer telegraphist stated that U-433 was fitted with UT Anlage, underwater telegraphic apparatus, the transmitters being sonic. The effective range was stated to be 10 miles. Echo sounding sets, shallow and deep, Esholot. Shallow and deep sounding sets were fitted. The deep echo sounding set, Tiefenlot, fitted in U-433, was stated to be effective up to 10,000 meters, depths being shown on an indicator. See Confidential Book 405131. Wireless telegraph apparatus. U-433 was stated to be fitted with 3 wireless telegraph transmitters, 1 long wave, 1 short wave, and 1 spare, an all-wave receiver for long and short waves, and 1 short-wave receiver were fitted. Surface endurance. Prisoners stated that the surface endurance of boats of this type was from 8,000 to 10,000 miles. See CB 405133. Device. Most prisoners stated that U-433 had no device or badge on her conning tower, although one prisoner maintained that this was a horseshoe, which device was used when the city of Hanover, where I, the commanding officer, was born, adopted the boat. Hanover had presented the boat with books, a gramophone, and records. Appendix. List of crew of U-433, survivors, officers 6, chief and petty officers 13, men 19, total 38. Casualties. Chief and petty officers 1, men 5, total 6. Total crew. Officers 6, chief and petty officers 14, men 24, total 44.